First up is Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, which is quite a mouthful to say. I always call Marvel Weeks a bye week because, quite frankly, at this point, if you have already invested this much time and energy into the MCU, you're not going to skip one of the movies. And if you haven't already made your way into the MCU, you certainly aren't going to jump in with this one. So you're either seeing it or you're not based on that. Whether or not it's objectively or subjectively good is a separate story, but chances are you're going to go see this movie. So this is not a spoiler. I will say you really will want to have seen Loki and probably Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness for this to make any sort of sense, but I have not seen Loki in a while, and so I was a little fuzzy on stuff. And I gotta say, the original Ant-Man / the first Ant-Man is one of my favorite MCU movies. I definitely gravitate towards the humor of that, and I think one of the things that worked really, really well was the ensemble in that one. I loved Michael Pena in it. You know, I felt like the grounding of it in the real world while also acknowledging that we're in a superhero movie was really fun, and that fact that Scott Lang is somewhat more of an everyman hero versus a super genius or, you know, somebody who's born with like ridiculous powers. The fact that he is technically speaking or started out as a mere mortal was something to ground to. But then by the time we've gotten to Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, we are so far past those roots. And it's just an entirely different world. There are some touches of comedy in it, and those were the moments that I definitely enjoyed the most. But then you've also got Jonathan Majors as Kang the Conqueror, who, you know, this, again, if you've been keeping up with any of this, they have set up as the big bad of the next phase or whatever it is. And Jonathan Majors is an excellent actor. He and Paul Rudd and Evangeline Lilly and you know, Kathryn Newton, who joined as Cassie Lang, and Michelle Pfeiffer and Michael Douglas, they are in a different movie than Jonathan Majors is in. And sometimes even physically, like visually, I'm like, I don't think you filmed this on the same day, or I don't think you're in the same room together, just based on how the characters behave. And so I think it was a really odd choice to have this be his, I mean, Loki was sort of his introduction, but this be the big moment for him on the big screen for Kang. I didn't feel like stylistically it meshed as well as I would have liked. I would have imagined there are potentially other heroes, in quotes, to pair him up against that would have tonally made more sense versus this kind of goofy, you know, grounded guy. That's not to knock his performance. I just think, again, everyone was just in a different film. And I did actually see Jonathan Majors in another role for a movie that's coming out. And I was like, oh, this is kind of the anti-hero / villain performance I would have liked to see in Ant-Man, because it felt like he was in the world that the other characters were in that movie versus this, where they're just sometimes soliloquizing at each other. It's very strange. So like I said, you're probably going to see this either way. I think there are things that have diluted since the first one. The dynamics have become a little strained. There are still some really strong characters in it. I think Michael Douglas is very funny in this. I love getting to see Michelle Pfeiffer shine. I wish her character she simultaneously has a lot to do, but it also felt like she had nothing to do. It's an odd balance there. The quantum realm itself, like all that stuff, felt like a Star Wars movie. In fact, there are points where I was like, I'm pretty sure that's just a recycled prop from the Star Wars warehouse, or like the costuming and things like that. Like I said, I think one of my favorite things was the grounding of the real world nature of it being in San Francisco and all the humor and all that stuff. And so taking it so far out of that universe, it didn't float my boat as much as I would have hoped. There were moments that I enjoyed. There are moments that are unsettling, maybe intentionally. MODOK is in this. He's in the trailer. That's not a spoiler, but MODOK is I'm not going to spoil it, but it was a choice. There were choices made there, and I have questions. But overall, I think if you are a fan of like the character of Ant-Man and that humor and stuff like that, this isn't going to be your favorite of these movies. This is a passable way to pass the time, but I don't think when we look back in however many years, we're going to go, oh yeah, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is my favorite Ant-Man movie or my favorite Marvel movie. It is a mile marker on the way to something bigger, but given the things that have been building to this something bigger, I am not as invested in this phase of the MCU as I thought it would be. I've also said this, that I think Kang is such a complicated storyline to do and to do well. And so having to tell it over multiple timelines with other characters and spread out so if you don't binge right before, like you forget things, it's a harder one to pull off. And I am still gonna watch everything, but I'm not as excited as I was to be like, oh, you know, we have a Thanos big bad, we have a thing. I think they're trying to inject more emotional turmoil and investment in it, but I don't know if it's working yet. Again, we're early in the phase, but overall, you're still going to see it. Let's be honest. If you were going to see it, you're going to see it. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. I didn't have a bad time at it. I just didn't walk away being like, yay, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. So 3 out of 5 for me. The other film I have this week is a World War II spy thriller starring Tony Leung. It's called Hidden Blade, and I will not lie, that is the primary reason I decided to watch this movie. Big fan. Unfortunately, even Tony Leung can't save the entirety of this film. I think he does a really good job in it, but there are some other things going on that I don't think work as well for the film, and it was honestly a bit of a challenge to follow along. Anytime there is a film about double-crossing and spies and espionage and all that stuff, you know, you are meant to be hopefully some level of confused, or at least uncertain, because if you know everybody's motivation at every single point, then what's the point of the spy thriller-ness of it? However, I think they made some choices that were a little challenge. So one, and I don't think this ever got explained in it, but all the characters speak either different languages or dialects and yet have absolutely no trouble understanding each other, which is possible, but it's also a story about, you know, the Chinese resistance against Japan, and then there are subgroups within China fighting with each other, and, you know, there's just a lot going on, and if you are someone who's just generically reading the subtitles anyway, you might not notice the nature of the language differences. It might just all sound the same to you, which is kind of a bummer, but you know, if you are aware, you'd be like, why, that man is speaking Japanese, that man is speaking Mandarin, that man's speaking Cantonese, like how do they all understand each other without any acknowledgement of it? And there are plenty of films that sort of get away with that, but this was odd given the circumstances. You know, all it takes is just a little bit of explanation because they are in spycraft, and so, you know, it just don't let us assume, though, like acknowledge that they speak each other's languages. Anyway, the fact that I'm getting hung up on the minor things like that is not a great sign, right? I think visually it's well done. You know, it's a period piece, as I said, so the fashion seems on brand and all this stuff, but it doesn't matter if the story isn't compelling. And I think they also made a decision to tell it in a non-linear fashion, which, again, works really well for some things. Given how much they are trying to confuse you in this, I think they actually generated extra confusion in a way that they were not intending to, unfortunately. So, I almost want to say, you know, just for Tony Leung alone, you could watch it, because he does have, like, thinking about his performance, I'm like, there are some really, really good moments in it, but unfortunately, I don't think the other parts of it live up to it, and as a whole, it's a bit of a challenge. You know, I certainly hope there are people out there who enjoy the entire performance, but I get the sense that, like, specific scenes might make their way online someday, and you'll be like, oh, that's a great monologue, or that's a great whatever, but as an entire filmic piece, not the most consistent thing, so I'm gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5.